Hello and welcome in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Particularly important prayer for what we're about to do. In a recent talk of mine, I referred to the alphabet people, and a number of you have written in saying you thought this was unnecessarily disparaging and perhaps a bit disrespectful. Did I really know what I was doing? And so what we're going to talk about at the moment is the alphabet people and censorship. And I'm trying to explain why I've taken the approach that I have. First of all, it's very clear that if you talk about same-sex attraction in a way that is politically unacceptable in the media, you will get censored. And it's precisely this issue of censorship that I want to look at. I want to talk, as we get closer to the end of this offering, about what the implications of the censorship are. Why should Christians be censorship? Why should anyone be thrown off the public media and be silenced? What are the implications of that? What's it about? Don't we live in a free democratic society where the exchange of opinions is welcomed and that's what we do? Jordan Peterson is quite right when he says the reason we need to articulate our beliefs is to test them out. As indeed that's what I'm doing to some extent with my friends on the other end of the camera and responding to people's questions in order to articulate a little better and think through things a little bit more clearly. So one of the things we find is that the censorship algorithms are highly attuned to the normal language, and it seems in a slightly playful way at the moment that using the word alphabet doesn't automatically bring the full shock of censorship upon one. But there are other reasons too, and one of the reasons is that alphabet acronyms are exactly what the heterodox sexual movement have adopted to describe themselves. So at the moment, I think the most usually used list is LGBTQ QIP2SAA. Once we get past LGBT, some of you may wonder what these things stand for. The list continues, and in fact the full vocabulary of this dissident heterodox movement stretches to pages. So the alphabet is the way in which they've chosen to present themselves, and it has become a little ridiculous. I mean, at what point do you stop and say, I'm just going to use the first four? Are you only really committed if you go on with QQIP2SAA, and then what about the ones that follow? So any sense of disparagement or ridiculousness isn't begun at my end, it's begun at the other end. And the other element of this is really quite important, is that this is presented as a solid and single political movement, but the political unity is completely unreal. Dave Shavas does a pretty hard-hitting comedy routine where he talks about how LGBT are not on the same page at all with each other. Homosexual women and homosexual men are not natural allies. Left to themselves in the subculture, they don't speak very well of each other. Bisexuals, some people have described as just greedy. They're neither L nor G, but they're just pan-operative. And T's, well, T's are late to the table, but T's and L's are now locked in mortal combat as the transgender community attacks the TERFs with some violence. So the political unity of the whole alphabet acronym, we might call it, is a cosmetic untruth. It isn't the case. And actually, as one talks about, let's just say the first four letters, as if they were a single cause with single aims and single identity, we're not telling the truth about them or about our own perception of them. When the pressure is on, or under certain circumstances, they have different aims, different self-understanding. So it's politically unreal. And to some extent, calling them the alphabet people is intended to say this is an unreality. This can't be taken seriously at the level it presents itself, and it simply can't, as a matter of fact. It's philosophically unreal. I was quite influenced by for a while by a literary critic called Gore Vidal. The background to this is that for about 15 years I was very strongly pro the whole LGBT community agenda, partly because I worked at a very progressive university and I had a good many gay and lesbian students that I liked very much and cared for. I wanted to protect and was deeply sympathetic to the particular journey of self-understanding they found themselves on. I have to say it was also those students who helped set me free from it. I remember one lesbian in particular who'd been a very provocative and very politically a woman with a lot of political leverage, who I discovered on the internet about 10 years after she graduated, and she said, "This is fantastic. I'm in love again." I said, "Wonderful. Who is she?" "No, she's a he. I'm in love with this man." And I said, "Look, I sweated blood for you to be a lesbian. Are you telling me you never were?" She said, "Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Let's just move on. Let me tell you about the man I'm in love with." And one of the things that we discovered that is, again, something that's true but not allowed to be said, is that there really is a fluidity of sexual appetite and identity, more amongst women than men, but there are a good many women who had a lesbian period and then adopted a pragmatic heterosexuality. Less so with men, it's true, but then that's another example of why lesbians and gays are not just biologically symmetrical examples of one another on different sides of the gender gap. They're very different in many ways, and again, to treat them as a single organic unity is a very serious mistake. But Gore Vidal was one of the people who invented the term gay, and he did it to protect some of his homosexual friends who were having a lot of trouble, and they really were being marginalized. Towards the end of his life, as a seasoned campaigner for gay rights, he changed his mind, and he said, "I've done a dreadful thing. I've invented a philosophy that defines us by our sexual and romantic appetite, by who we're attracted to." He said, this is a terrible thing to have done, because as human beings we're so much more complex than our sexual erotic appetite. What does that say about the rest of our mental imagination, about the other arts, about our relationships, political, philosophical, as well as emotional? This is to cram humanity down into a box of who you're sexually turned on by, is a diminishment that goes against everything I believe about human beings, Gore Vidal said. And it was actually Gore Vidal's analysis near the end of his life, effectively his repudiation of the political agenda he'd begun, that had a very real effect on me as well. Another thing that affected me quite profoundly was to discover what the real numbers are. So the National Office of Statistics, in this country at any rate, puts the LGBT community at about 1.8%. So it's really quite low. It's entirely possible it's grown a bit as people under 20 particularly experiment with different identities, partly because it's cool and a bit edgy. But effectively what that means is the rest of society is about 98% straight. And my own view of this is that the circumstances we're in are the fault of the straight 98%. I say fault's a wrong, not the most helpful word, but the responsibility of the 98%. 1.8, 1.9, 2, pick your number, it doesn't matter very much, percent of the population are not enough to change the whole culture in a way in which the culture has been radically overturned. One of the things that the gay liberation movement did was to change the numbers, so that in America they deliberately picked the number 8%. And they said untruthfully that 8% of the population were of an alphabet persuasion. And they did this because this was the magic number that meant in any extended family, everyone would have one gay member. So this was presented about being inclusive to your own family. But it was a political strategy. It wasn't true. The number is very much lower though I expect it's growing. So demographically, this is unreal as well. Why? And we have to ask a really very serious question. How is it that 1.8% of the population has managed to change the whole self-definition of a culture? But not only that, and this is the very serious bit, but to introduce a program of near totalitarian censorship so that your answer to whether or not you believe in, quote, gay marriage will affect whether you get employment or not, or airtime or not, or a career or not. The idea that you can be excommunicated from society on this one rather odd point, which does involve changing the definition of marriage that's been held in almost all places at almost all times, and been seen effectively to have to do with a man and a woman creating children for the continuation of the culture, because the whole culture depends upon men and women having children and there being another generation, let alone our pensions, let alone care for the elderly. So politically it's unreal, philosophically it's unreal, demographically it's unreal. Spiritually I think it's unreal too. So there are a number of ways of describing the spiritual position, but let's start with the heterodox. Let's start with the 98%. The fact is that sex is very powerful, and most people get derailed by it at some point in one way or another. We find ourselves blackmailed by somebody, or blackmailing somebody, or using it inappropriately. And one of the great problems that's taken place, certainly during my lifetime, is that the capacity for confusing sexual intimacy with power and emotional abuse has grown enormously, because it's 50 or 60 years ago, on the whole, there was an expectation that sexual intimacy of any serious kind would take place within marriage, and marriage was a place where things got sorted out, and effectively the rest of the population was free from sexual pressure from people they weren't married to, with obvious exceptions. But the moment you moved it from beyond marriage, it becomes an anarchic free-for-all where the strongest, the most persuasive, the most attractive even, or those suffering the greatest appetites win, and the weakest and the most vulnerable lose. And so paradoxically, in a culture which privileges vulnerability, we're actually fostering a lifestyle that causes most damage to the most vulnerable. And there isn't any sense that we should be ashamed of that, or think twice about it, or look for a series of moral rules that protect the most vulnerable from the most predatory. There are occasional moments like the Me Too movement where some attempt is made to control it, but very few. Spiritually, what's going on? Well, C.S. Lewis was quite is celebrated for one of his insights where he talks about us being essentially half angel and half animal, amphibious really. So we're both at home in matter, in our bodies, in a biologically animal-like existence, and yet we're also very at home in spirit, in soul, in prayer, in moral and metaphysical aspiration. And this duality in human beings can either forge the strongest and most powerful and most wonderful expression of human beings are, if the body and the soul live together in some kind of reconciled interplay that brings the best out of both of them, or it can cause a degree of very damaging schizophrenia if they're set against each other. I think it's fairly clear that in terms of cultural history, we're at the schizophrenic edge at the moment. And so the body and sexual desire, sexual appetite, sexual conquest, sexual expression have become the highest values, and perhaps that explains why the 98% have chosen to go along with, if you like, the alphabet self-definition, because this sexualization of society gives a liberalism that many people feel they're attracted to. It allows people to pursue appetites that otherwise they wouldn't be able to pursue, that would be constrained by some sense of collective moral imperative, which has been diluted and gone completely missing. So this lack of collective moral imperative I lay at the feet of the 98% who are straight. I think what the straight community have done in the last 100 years is ethically hugely irresponsible. And in one sense, it's no surprise at all that the alphabet subvariant has said, well, we would like to be part of this, please. And particularly same-sex attracted men, because the sexual appetite of men is voracious, and in a straight context is much contained and disciplined by women and what women will put up with, until we turn them into honorary men culturally and sexually, at which point the damage to women became much more developed, and also the damage to men if they had but known it. But same-sex attracted men live in a particularly voracious sexual climate like no other. What do we do about the relationship between body and spirit? Well, it's always been the Church's understanding that the flesh and the spirit are locked in this struggle, and ultimately the body is going to give way. We're not going to have any bodies. Ultimately, the spirit must take priority, because that's what we're left with when entropy sets in and there's a biological collapse. No more body, therefore no more sex. And as we prepare for the end of our lives, and since Jesus tells us everything we can possibly know about what we're built for in our fate, moral judgment in the face of the most pure God, then that offers some impetus for us in our struggle to contain the body, to contain the flesh. Now, flesh in Christian language is a technical word. It's part of a philosophical vocabulary. It doesn't just stand for the body and its sexual appetites. It goes much farther than that. It's to do with all our lower appetites, including pride and appetites of one kind or another. And one of the things we do as Christians is we try and crucify the flesh. We try and overcome it and contain it, move beyond it. Jesus said that if any part of your anatomy offends you or leads you into sin, whether it's your eye or your hand, and some people can become particularly vivid in terms of the way they think what that stands for, then it's better to pluck your eye out rather than be trapped by imaginative lust that you look at all the time. Better to cut your hand off than be trapped by any other kind of lust, because Jesus said, better to go into heaven with not as much of your body as you might like than to go into hell with all your body. That was the language that he used. It's pretty stark. It's pretty important. And so Christians look at the appetites, and particularly we look at the way in which human beings are designed to run after money and power and pride and sex particularly. And we take them seriously and engage in a full-time struggle against them. And the problem with the alphabet people and the whole agenda is that they want to give sexual appetite a pass and say, well, whether or not you are struggling with pride or gluttony or power of any kind, everyone gets a free pass on the sex front. And Christians have to say, no, we don't think we do. And partly because, not only because we're in a struggle between flesh and spirit, but also because sex is a means to a very important end. And the end is not sex in itself, as it has become in the alphabet philosophical world. Sex is an end to family. It's an end to children. It might be very pleasurable. It might be easy, difficult, very pleasurable, a little pleasurable, but in the end, it's a process by which we make children. Making children is the most extraordinary thing, philosophically as well as biologically, because we become co-creators. Anyone who's been a parent knows that this extraordinary moment when you look at this living miracle, this bundle of of extraordinariness, which is a person in their own right, and you know you didn't do it. All you did was make love, and biology then cooked whatever it was that came from that. And this soul, this personality gets infused into the body, and we know we have nothing to do with it. I mean, it inherits some of our characteristics genetically, but it's a miracle every time. And effectively what we're being asked to do is we're becoming co-creators with God for his purpose in making humanity. Why did God make humanity? Why are we here at all in the first place? Some of the better answers we grasp after as Christians are that God made us because he wanted us to engage with him in love and praise. He wanted us to enjoy his love. He wanted love to have a greater auditorium, a greater participation. For the Holy Trinity is love, and the angels, the hosts of heaven, are love. And he wanted to make a creature who had free will, and so whose capacity for love was something that got chosen rather than anything automatic or robotic. AI can't love, robots can't love, but human beings can because we have free will. And so we share with God in this extraordinary venture of co-creation. He uses us to make souls, to make people. He makes them our children, which allows us to invest much of ourselves in them, if only through a slightly misplaced sense of narcissism, but anything can be turned to good. And sex is the means to that end, that miraculous end, that mind-blowing end, that philosophically take the top of your head off end. Sex doesn't compare to that. It's just the means to an end. But by elevating it into an end in itself, two dreadful things happen. I mean, first of all, it becomes an idolatry. And secondly, we begin not to make children anymore. And one of the characteristics of the culture of the last 60 years is we have not made a lot of children through the way in which we've used birth control, and we've killed, slaughtered children we have made in the womb in the name of feminism and women's rights. The problem is the moment you see a human being validly present after conception, and if it's not, then what point is it? There is no point at which you can say, here's an alternative moment for the soul to enter the body, for a living human being to be engaged in the process of becoming. But the moment you see the conceived egg to be a human being, then any damage done to that egg is damage done to a person. Even if it's a pre-born person, still a person, never a clump of cells, for they are living and dividing and becoming, and we were all that once. So the danger of turning sex into an end in itself is idolatry. We worship it, we want it for its own right, and like any other kind of gluttony, it's very bad for us, both physically and spiritually, and we destroy the purpose for which sex was invented, e.g. children themselves. This is a very serious place to be in. Let's put this now into a context of the cosmic fight between good and evil. One of the things that we discover is that evil flourishes with child sacrifice. It's hard to explain this. You kind of either get it or you don't, and if you don't, there's not much I can do to help. But the moment you get that in the past, barbaric societies have fed cosmic evil by the sacrifice of children, the most vulnerable, the most precious imaging of God that there is. Once you get that, then you see the whole abortion industry in a very different light. And it's one of the things that has led to people who've suddenly seen it becoming profoundly committed campaigners to end abortion. It's one of the reasons why people are willing to be arrested as they pray for the souls of murdered children near abortion centres. Interestingly enough, rather than just being an irritant because the abortion industry isn't going to stop anyway, these people become the most extraordinary provocation. And the point at which we think this is spiritually charged is the point at which if you like, secular society overreacts. It gets very angry at people who say these are children and this is an immoral act. It gets very angry, almost as if there is a spirit of evil that is personally offended by any attempt to interrupt what its appetite is feeling on. Now, some people may think this is a little bit too metaphysical, a bit too dualistic, a bit too superstitious, medieval, although in my opinion, medieval period was one of the most developed and sophisticated and wonderful periods have been, but that's a different argument. But the trouble is, if you do turn this into part of the material that informs us about the philosophical struggle between good and evil, then the way sex is being used begins to look as though it's an instrumentation of evil itself. If you like, evil is taking part of who we are and what we should be, part of something that is designed to be used to a good end, and taking, if you like, one of the most powerful bits of it and using it against humanity. And whether we blame the 98% or whether we want to argue with the 1.8% doesn't really matter very much. Collectively, we've done this together. Christians, however, having seen the implications of this, are resisting it. If you told me that 20, 30 years ago that the whole movement for gay marriage, founded on the basis of equality and inclusion, fairness, niceness, affirming people who lived on the outside of society, who were a bit different and wanted to belong. If you told me this was going to become one of the most significant weapons to delegitimize anybody who didn't accept it, I don't think I'd have believed it. I couldn't see how such a fair and nice and kind movement could have had that effect. But in fact, that's actually what has happened. That's not reasonable. And whenever you find something unreasonable, irrational, something utterly disproportional, that's the point where I begin to look for metaphysical reasons. And I think I found them. I think the metaphysical analysis of this is that evil has taken part of our human capacity for good, in particular our sexuality, and is using it against ourselves. And therefore, since I can't talk about this using language clearly, or the algorithms will get me, or I'll be thrown off YouTube, I need to use a certain code. And since the alphabet code is slightly ridiculous, it's illogical, it doesn't tell the truth, I hope you'll forgive me if I occasionally talk about the alphabet people, rather than to use a more technical language that, if you like, I would prefer to use. But unfortunately, the alphabet people have set themselves against the church, even to the point where there is an attempted coup from within the churches to change heterosexual marriage as God tells us he intended it, since we believe in Revelation. We believe the scriptures show his mind. This coup is intended to cover God's voice up and produce a different voice. And at the moment, the churches are in a profound civil war to try and save their own integrity by holding on faithfully to what they reasonably believe God has said, in distinction to this movement from the alphabet people to replace it with what the alphabet people say God has said. The stakes are very high. They are to do with what we believe Revelation is. They are to do with the integrity of the church. They are to do with whether or not people who've believed what Christians have believed in all places at all times get thrown into prison, marginalized, unemployed, excommunicated from civil society, looked down on, despised, and suffer the very fate that the alphabet people said was happening to them, and they asked other people not to do to them. That's odd. So this is not about being uncompassionate. It's not about marginalizing people. It's not even about trying to impose one view on another. Many of us would be entirely happy to have different ways, different codes in society, and say to anybody, you choose your code, live by it as well as you like. By the way, this is the code we think God has asked us to live by. Come and join us. It's good. It works. We'd be very happy with a level playing field, real inclusion like that. That's not what we're getting. We're getting something much more malign, something much more exclusive, something that's persecuting, something that's entirely unreasonable. And therefore we're entitled to suspect that the metaphysical and moral situation we're in is no longer neutral. Actually, there's a malignity there. We will continue to talk with as much love as we can. For all us human beings are made in the image of God, and all of us need to get our appetites sorted out. If not one, then another. In the end, we all kneel before God, asking him for mercy. But also we have a responsibility to tell the truth about him, the truth he's given us, the truth that has set us free, the truth that becomes incarnate in Jesus. And nothing comes before that. And we simply attempt to do that with as much love and compassion, honesty and integrity as we can. Forgive us if sometimes our sense of humour or sense of the ridiculous gets the better of us. It's a small price to pay for keeping the faith. God bless you.